protecting the environment and our development. And mind you, nobody will die because the people that die because of climate change compared to the people that die because of poverty, hunger, and lack. The values do not cover up. So maybe for our expert, the person in the field, he can help to balance up for us.
Okay, let's just take a break. When you get back, we're going to be diving more into the conversation. Welcome back from that mini break. You are still here on Your Space with your host, Hania Arinaito. Now, just before we went into the break, there was a very hot question coming in from Joel, and just going to go into that. Joel, what exactly, again, was your question?
Okay, like when we look at Uganda's development, where it is going and the plans that it has, we see that Uganda is compared to other countries around the world, we are not doing well. That's like honest, like call a spade a spade. Now, time comes and we discover our oil. And I was reading these comments online, and some lawyers, actually they are legal experts, some lawyers were saying Uganda should seize EACOP. You know EACOP, East African Crude Oil Pipeline. Uganda should seize EACOP because of the adverse effects that it is having on the environment. That's just an example. Or Uganda should not cut down the trees in Mabira Forest because Mabira Forest is a natural habitat for birds and mammals. It should not cut down the forest to plant sugar canes. So my question is, what is the most pressing issue for Uganda? Is it poverty or climate change?
Okay, well, and am I allowed to respond to that?
Yeah, please, go ahead.
So this is the idea, and many a time when we have these conversations, there's usually a temptation to think that environmental concerns and development are mutually exclusive, that you either have one or the other. I assure you, and for example, when you see the disasters that happened in Libya, people that had actually constructed, you know, their bungalows and flats and their expensive cars were all washed away in one go. You see? So all the wealth that accumulated was washed away by one incident of a climate-related disaster. You see? So the idea then is, and when you look at, for example, the National Environmental Act, and the regulations made thereunder, one of the principles of environmental management is how do we have sustainable development, in the context of environmental preservation, conservation, and protection, because they two are not mutually exclusive. So, for example, the Convention on the Forest, for instance, that when you cut down the forests and then plant sugar canes, and you know these forests are the natural resource, and so the government protects them in trust and holds them in trust for the people. Why? Because you will not understand this, but when you look at the global statistics on why such a forest will play a critical role in Uganda's carbon sequestration. And sequestration really is how many or how much of the gigatons of carbon dioxide that are emitted are again, you know, gotten back as a sink. And why that is important is because we're able to have a climate that is inhabitable in Uganda here. And we've seen that if we do not preserve those forests, because globally, statistically speaking, we have about 10 million hectares of forest cover lost globally. And in Africa, it's about 4 million of those. And it's been increasing over the years. So imagine if the preceding generations did what we are doing today, we would not have these forests here today. You see? So these forests are very important because they're able to sustain the climate that we can live in. So for you, when you cut them down and plant the sugar canes, it's not sustainable. And at the end of the day, and I hate to say this, but it is the truth, the person who is championing the cutting down of this forest is not Ugandan. Tomorrow they can pack and go.
And leave.
And you remain in this Uganda with the climate-related disasters. So it's very important for us to understand that environmental protection and development are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they have a symbiotic relationship.
I think his question is how. My question as well, how can they be symbiotic? Like, how can they work together in order to achieve
Anna,
one goal?
I think it calls for responsible use of the environment. For instance, if you're going to cut a tree, why don't you plant 5? Why don't you plant and replace? We have got the swamps, and the swamps do the distilling or sieving into the lakes. If we are going to do fishing, why don't you do responsible fishing and get the mature fish, not the little fish, and you know. And it just talks about responsibility, because when you look at the environment today, like Howard has just said, there are deadliest environmental threats which the country is experiencing today. One of them being pollution, because it takes a long time to clear the effects of pollution. Both air pollution, water pollution, even the soil pollution. It's a challenge. Then now we have got the population growth. Population growth such that even the land available may not be enough for everybody. And you find a few people holding square kilometers or square miles of land to themselves. Then we have got the effects of global warming, like Howard has explained. Depletion of resources, climate change, the ozone depletion, and so on. And you realize that all this is happening because people are not responsible. They have breached the laws and regulations. They have gone the other side, and they are committing acts of corruption in obtaining licenses to do the logging, to do illegal activities on wetlands. Like the example he gave, you construct your building there, and then in a short while the flood comes and washes it away. And corruption is happening in different ways. There is grand corruption and petty corruption. Petty corruption where people are just taking bribes. Grand corruption where they are doing the big things. Then there is supply and demand kind of corruption, and so on. Public and private corruption, and it is really eating us up. So what does that tell us to do? It still goes back to the responsibility. If we uphold respect for humanity and the environment, then we will know that, well, if I cut down this tree, tomorrow the weather may change. The ecosystem will be affected. If I dump this garbage on the drainage channel, tomorrow the place will be flooded and will be affected as human beings. So at the end of the day, it basically takes us back to the drawing board. Responsibility. I have seen young people taking on the greening projects in schools, beginning the green clubs, where we're encouraging people to grow trees, to plant flowers, to keep the places green. And it is really happening. And I like the example, I don't know whether it's Howard or Joel, who gave where people are using the plastics. They're recycling them, they're using them for making jewelry, dustbins, or even construction, which is really, really helpful. Yes.
I love how you bring, but I think we could go to, yes, those are all really great ways for us to engage with the community when it comes to protecting the environment. But how do we get there, Joel? You are always among a number of young people. How do we move and get to that point where we are being part of the recycling and the initiatives and all this? How do we move to that point right now in Uganda?
Yeah, all right. First of all, as I understand climate change and its adverse effects, we have to work with the global, with the world. We have to work with other countries. What do I mean? Right now, we are in Uganda here. We are taking all the initiatives, turning plastic and all the things, planting the trees. But the biggest polluter in the world is not Uganda. The biggest polluter in the world are those countries out there. I won't mention them. So we end up suffering for the sins that, yes, for the sins that we do not commit. So I don't know how we can do that. Globally, the world is closing down on use of oil and crude oil and its resources. Yes, Uganda is just discovering its own what? Its own oil. And right now, the things that we are experiencing, I don't know whether I will receive clarity, but some of the disasters that we experience here in Uganda, I do not believe it is because of our own actions. So
Yeah, but
Yeah,
so. How do we get there, Howard? And I find this interesting because so many people actually have this particular question. But how do we get to a point as young people in Uganda where we are freely involving in activities that are solving our environmental problems?
Thank you so much, Hannah. So I think I need to go back to the basics. When we talk about the environment and the threat to the environment, we're talking about the triple planetary crisis. Yeah? And the triple planetary crisis, as you hear it, is threefold. Firstly, we're talking about climate change. And second, you're talking about biodiversity loss. And three, you're talking about pollution. Yeah? So, and when you look at, for example, at the National Environment Act and the National Climate Change Act of the first one is 2019, the National Climate Change Act is 2021. One of the integral components of the act is education and awareness creation. Yeah? Because that is how we bring about mindset change. Yeah? Because you'll be amazed at how many people out there do not understand what you mean by climate change. They don't understand what you mean by biodiversity loss, what you mean by pollution. They don't understand it. And it's even worse when it gets to the policymakers. Imagine policymakers that do not understand what that is or how bad the situation is. Sort of encourages a complacency in the promulgation of laws, but also in their enforcement. So I think how we can get out there is by leveraging the existing structures to undertake deliberate and intentional education, literacy, and awareness creation. So that we bring the masses to power, to bring them to the knowledge of how bad the situation is, how they can be meaningfully involved, but also our policy makers. We need sometimes to concentrate on, the people down there at the grassroots or in the rural areas, yeah? But the people that make the decisions are actually the policy makers, yeah? And there's a convention I was having recently, because some of the work that I've been doing is developing toolkits for children and youth, because I work mostly with children and youth in the environment and energy spaces, then SDG 7 and 13. And I was proposing that now we need to target policy makers. Can we have a toolkit that can equip policymakers and empower them to understand firstly, but also to be deliberate and intentional, coming up with policies and laws, but also in enforcement of these laws. Because sometimes we have the laws, like the National Environment Act of 2019, the National Climate Change Act of 2021, but implementation. Yeah, so how can we equip them to participate meaningfully in the implementation of these laws?
Okay, now we are coming to the end of the show. I feel like we needed another 3 consecutive hours for us to finish this topic. But just before we say goodbye, I would just like to have the people on my panel just give us a final word. Just make it as brief as possible. I'll start with Joel.
Yes, this is our environment, this is our world. Yes, we either take care of it or we lose it.
Yeah. Dr. Patricia?
I think environmental protection is a collective responsibility, which we must not only leave for the enforcement agencies, but collectively we should take up and own up and be responsible to preserve and conserve our environment.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yes, Howard.
Thank you, Hannah. So my message, parting shortly to the viewers, is that this planet is what we have. We don't have a planet B, yeah? And it takes collective action, as Doctor has mentioned. We all have a part to play. We could be whistleblowers, we could bring our leaders to book or hold them accountable. We could, meaningfully involve ourselves in projects on restoration, protection, and preservation. But this is our heritage, this planet is what we have, and we must all be meaningfully involved.
Yes. I hope that after this you will have respect for your environment and for Uganda. Allow me to say bye-bye. See you again next Sunday. Goodbye.
Anyone who wants to become a pledge.
What fresh hell is this?
Get up with some mathematics. You need logic for money acrobatics. Money is confusing like laws of physics.
It'll wake you up in the middle of the night. A feeling that someday they'll come for you and your children.
The